right off the bat, I just want to introduce myself. On behalf of the CMC Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement, my name is Josh. I'm a member of the class of 2020. And I want to welcome you to the first installment of Lectio in Colloquium, a CMC book club. And today we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Wendy Lower, the John K. Roth Professor of History and George R. Roberts Fellow here at CMC. While it's hard to only give a brief bio on Professor Lower, I'll do my very best. She received her bachelor's degree from Hamilton College before going on to get her PhD at American University in Washington, D.C., my hometown. So for anyone in D.C., shout out to D.C. Over the course of her epic career, Professor Lower has become a well-known expert in Holocaust studies, comparative genocide studies, human rights, modern Germany, Ukraine, and women's history. Not only are we extremely fortunate to have Professor Lower teaching here at CMC, but we are all the more fortunate to have her serving as the director of the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights, one of CMC's 11 research institutes. And by being here today, you are supporting the Mgrublian Center, so thank you so much. Last but not least, I want to once again acknowledge that the Ravine is the winner of the 2022 National Jewish Book Award, on top of recognitions in the 2022 Wingate Literary Prize and the 2022 PEN American Literary Awards. So with all of that, Professor Lower, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
This is a treat to see all of you. Many of you I've not seen at all for a while. So thank you, Jim. I guess you must be Zooming in from up north, Northern California, and we've got hi. It's great. And Jill Stark is here, and some of my board members from the Mgrublian Center, and my students and parents of students. So and folks that I usually see at the ATH. So it's just wonderful to see you. And thank you for taking time out today to talk about my book. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Claremont, and maybe nice where you are too. You could be doing other things. So I just really appreciate that you're here. We're going to look at this photograph in a moment. It's very disturbing. Just wanted to warn you about that. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the book, kind of the story behind the book, not take up too much time because I'd love to hear from you and discuss the book with you. I even sent some questions out. So I will be very conscious of the fact that it is 1:04 right now, and I'm not going to go more than 20 minutes, but I'm going to get right down to business here and do the traditional, the routine here of this share screen. So at this point, I think you've all received the book. That was part of the club, part of the program. You don't need to look at the cover again. But some of the elements of the book that I started out with have to do with just this: what do we do with these kinds of photographs of suffering? And not only in the realm of the Holocaust, for which we have a massive archive of what we would call kind of atrocity images. In fact, the Holocaust and the Second World War is the most photographed war and genocide on record. So we have all this available to us. We live in this digital age. These things are circulating on the internet. They're often placed on, they're consumed. They're like placed on coffee mugs and various, packagings, including, look at this picture of Anne Frank. Some of you may not know that Anne Frank is the kind of face of a Japanese tampon company, for instance. So some of these images are used in ways that are obviously very inappropriate. Some of them are used in ways that are kind of perfunctory. They just, brought in as an illustration in a book or displayed in a museum, and they don't have much information there. People aren't kind of doing a deep dive into where did this photograph come from, who took it, who are the people in it, and what can we learn? Maybe we can learn something from this photograph that we can't learn from other sources like diaries or memoirs or Nazi documentation. In addition, these photographs have photographs that depict extremes of suffering in this case, and especially ones that actually depict murder. I mean, these are action shots, some of these pictures that we're looking at here. We're looking at the image that's been titled The Last Jew in Vinnytsia here, of this man kneeling over this mass grave about to be shot. We have this family here also in Ukraine about to be shot. And then the other is this little boy with his hands raised. That's from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943. And this one is a liberation photo of these corpses. And Elie Wiesel is pictured here in this image of Buchenwald at liberation. And there's Anne Frank, and there's the entrance to Birkenau. So these are all part of our kind of collective imagination or recall of this history. But these images, we know, have a certain inherent kind of intrinsic power, these types of images, because they can document, they can serve as evidence of a crime. And so they have a certain agency, they can be brought into the courtroom. They have a certain power as far as policy making. Remember the image of the little boy, Alan Kurdi, who washed up on the beach in Bodrum in Turkey, and how that galvanized, especially the German government, to change their policy vis-a-vis Syrian refugees. So there's a lot at stake here. It's not just historical justice and research, but also the potential for redress and reform. I mentioned at the outset of the book, what would you do if you found an image of a lynching? And I wondered, why aren't we doing more work on some of these really rare traces of the past and that are shown to us in such a stark way. So this is the image that really captured my attention in 2009 that I decided to work on for the last decade. I worked on other things, but I was just kind of looking over the years in archives and carving out the time to find out more about it. It was taken on October 13th, 1941 in a small town west of Kiev in kind of central Ukraine called Mirapole. And what we're looking at here is the murder, the act of murder against a Jewish family. And this image was brought to my attention by two journalists who had kind of journeyed from Prague. They found it in the archives, had been sitting locked up in the archives and didn't see the light of day until the Soviet Union collapsed. That was an enormous opening for research on Eastern Europe, for research on kind of the crimes of the 20th century that occurred in these bloodlands in Eastern Europe and especially in Ukraine. And these researchers approached me. I just happened to be there working in the archives, and they said, Wendy's over there. She's interested in Ukraine, and I think she's been in this town, traveled through there. Maybe she has more information. And so I put down what I was doing and was so shocked by the stark portrait here of the killers on the right. It's a very, it's up close, it's vivid, it's stable. It's kind of following the rule of thirds, the way the photographer cropped it. But on the right, we've got those Ukrainians, and the one in the back is kind of grimacing and clearly in a kind of shooting position and so close to these killers. And I could see that they were Germans with their uniform caps and their epaulets and their collars. And I could make out these auxiliary uniforms of the Ukrainians, those Red Army coats. So my first reaction really was, maybe one of these killers is still around. Maybe we cannot bring these victims back, and I was determined to identify them. That's not how they want to be portrayed. But I thought, as far as like an immediate action, I could identify that killing unit. Down here in the foreground, I want to walk through the photo, and the folks in IT were great when I brought this into them here on campus. I said, I want a book that kind of picks apart different elements of a photograph and provides those different perspectives of the objects there, of the setting, of the scene, and to think about maybe some of the things that aren't portrayed, but these various perspectives. And that, could I cut out the image in that way? And the folks at IT said, yeah, we can do that. So then they developed this little presentation for me, which I've greatly benefited from. So I wanted to give them a little, acknowledge them. So these shoes in the foreground are really intriguing because they suggest, that another victim was there, and a male victim, and had been killed, just before, and that it's part of potentially kind of a mass murder operation. There's multiple victims. And these shoes, we can zoom in and zoom out with technology today, digital technology, and see the actual bullet casings around the shoes to see that there were indeed many more victims at this on this day at this location. But it's also an object in Holocaust memory and writing and memorialization about those who are missing, and the absence of presence and the presence of absence. And what do we do as historians when we are looking for the traces of the missing? What kinds of tools do we have available to us to find those, who were not registered as far as being deported to the camps? Because this is a study of what occurred before the mass gassings. This is the mass shootings that the Germans carried out. And this kind of mass murder, this kind of genocidal method, as you were, is actually more common, the use of open air shootings. And that, in the history of genocide, we have most victims are not known. I mean, in the Holocaust Museum, every year we read out those names, and Yad Vashem, the institution in Israel, has done a phenomenal job of trying to identify all the victims, but the fact is that most victims of genocide, we do not know. And those are kind of the missing that we have to think about and try to find out their stories. This was taken in broad daylight. And this chapter called The Holocaust by Bullets, the mass shootings that occurred in the former Soviet Union that started in the summer of 41, occurred in conjunction with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, so-called Operation Barbarossa. So this was really what the assault was against the Soviet Jews. And this raises questions about the locations of these events and the way that local topography and terrain, this is someone's hometown. In fact, those Jews, this was their hometown. We know from the photographer's testimony that those Ukrainians were calling out some of the victims by name. This was also their hometown. And this event is taking place at the edge of their town. And it's the sounds, the smells, the commotion, everything in that community on that day, they have that memory of that event, and that resonates in that location today. And it's part of the actual kind of environment there, the geological, the terrain. When you go back to the site, we'll look at it in a second, you can see the traces through like forensic archaeology, because this book draws on a lot of different disciplines, that, you know, the actual cratering of the landscape and these formations that genocide scholars and forensics folks have identified through aerial topography, that when you have a mass shooting and you're burying the victims, clothed or not, you know, there's displacement of soil, there's compression, there's different forms of decomposition that changes that landscape, and we can detect that. That's another clue. But it also is another feature of the story, which environmental historians have started to pursue more seriously in the last decades, and the ways that nature and our interactions with nature are part of our history. So the Germans used nature. There's agency in the way that they used ravines, they used rivers, they used swamps, they dynamited hillsides. And so this is part of the change that occurs in those places in this very kind of material environmental way. And the killers here now, this is, collaboration is a really big topic right now in Holocaust studies, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union and going into these crime scenes and realizing that it really is European history, that to answer the question of, how and why the magnitude of this crime, how could this happen? Well, is because it involved more than the Germans. It involved local Poles, Ukrainian policemen. It involved heads of state among his Axis collaborators in Croatia and Romania. And it is indeed kind of European history. And this image here, I think, is fascinating because these Ukrainians didn't speak any German. These German customs guards, as I found out, that was the agency they worked for, they didn't speak any Ukrainian. So there's no common connection. In fact, the Germans said, these Ukrainians are Untermenschen, they're inferiors, and they just were using them as tools here. But they shared this common anti-Semitic hatred. They could stand shoulder to shoulder and shoot these innocent women and children. And what does that mean as far as European history of anti-Semitism and these cross-cultural kinds of forms of hate, these connections? The smoke here I found also really intriguing and spoke to some ballistics experts and provided another clue as far as confirming that this was a mass shooting. And I did find out eventually that about 200 to 300 Jews were killed on that day. And the population of Jews in this town was about 950 when the Nazis arrived in 1941. But the smoke here is the ballistic, the blast is blowing that kind of hole there, that kind of halo around the woman's head, because there have been multiple, it's execution style, there have been multiple firings that have gone on. And now the smoke that was hovering is starting to rise, and they're puncturing it through the heat of the blast of their guns. And lastly, this image here in the center, which the photographer deliberately, we're looking, through his lens right now, directly, almost directly at the head of the mother, and his message there, his statement there about the family and the kind of importance of the family unit, not only in how the victims experienced the genocide and the horrors of it, the kind of the worst of it, to be murdered with your family members, have to make life choices based on your family members' who will emigrate, who will flee, who will hide. How does a mother comfort a child in this scene? So that piece of it to me was an element that had not been stressed enough in the literature. The experience of the family as kind of the worst of all forms of cruelty of experience, and that the genociders were very deliberate about that. In the summer of 1941, Hitler told his Croatian counterpart, his ally, so a few months before this event, that no Jewish family, he used the word family, should be left on the continent of Europe, and argued that in the past, Jews had been pushed out through, had been expelled from Spain in the 15th century, and referred to kind of the diaspora, and said they always come back because of their genealogical connection, that the descendants want to avenge the crimes that were committed against their parents or the persecution, what have you, and that this is the cycle of that history. And he wants to end that. That's his notion of a final solution, is to go root and branch after the entire family unit, which is consistent with Nazi racial ideology. Some of the materials that you read about in the book, I just wanted to refresh your memory a little bit. Now, the photographer actually provided his testimony. This was a really incredibly important document, to not only have the photograph, but to have the voice of the photographer. In fact, he was interrogated 3 times about that photograph and others he took because they were so incriminating. And I thought he must be a collaborator. You have a Ukrainian there, you have a German there, you have a Slovakian guard. He's also in uniform. And our Jewish victims, of course, they would view him as a collaborator. He's standing there with his uniform on, openly taking pictures. If they even noticed, isn't that another form of humiliation and torture on their part? But in the testimony that I read, and it goes into the post-war period here, this is 1958, our photographer Lubomir Scarivener, born in 1916, it says here, this is in Slovakian. I had to really colleagues to help me translate these documents. But he tells us a couple of really important things in his testimony, and these details matter. Number one, he tells us about his camera. And I'm teaching a course now on material culture, and I've come to appreciate that. It's called Objects of War and Genocide. And this work kind of inspired that course, because knowing what his camera was, which was a Zeiss Icon, and how much film he could put in it, and the camera didn't have a zoom lens, you can start to reconstruct the events, like how far was he standing from the actual murder site, how many pictures could he take, and what else was on that? What else did he take on that roll of film? And he tells us that that morning he had heard the commotion, and his commander said, Lubomir, go check it out. You're the company's scribe. You can document what's happening and write it into our report. And he went and he took these pictures. And it was really consistent with, and this is another picture he took. We found 5 out of what could have been 7 to 8 exposures. So it ends up being, as you saw in the book, his visual testimony. And this one's even better, because not better in the sense that this is a horrible scene, and we can see it's the same, the shoes. This woman here, one of my readers wrote to me from Sweden, and she had a lot of equipment that she applied to this particular image. And she was able to zoom in and zoom out and do some forensic work. And she's argued that in this woman's here, I thought that was an armband. She believes that's a child, that the woman is actually holding an infant, and that's blood. So that may be the case. That's something that's come out since the book has been published. But there's a better view of the Germans here, so you can see their uniforms. Those are not regular soldiers, regular army. Those are not Himmler's agencies. That's a whole different agency. It's an all-volunteer killing squad. And then these onlookers here, potential witnesses to be tracked down. But so here's our photographer, Dashing Man. This is post-war, and his actual camera that he donated to the Museum of the History of Jews in Bratislava. And the big discovery for me, as far as our photographer, was that he was actually a member of the resistance, and that this experience of witnessing these murders turned him into that direction. His character was already he didn't want to fight in the war. He didn't want to wear a uniform. He was a bit of a rebel, more of an artistic person, completely non-political, and just was drafted. It was forced to participate. But after he experienced witnessing these mass murders, and he realized this is a different kind of war, and I'm not continuing on with this, he went back home for Christmas break and then pretended to be sick and didn't go back to the front where he was supposed to. And he and his wife engaged in these resistance efforts and even showed these photographs to Jews who were being called up to be deported to the gassing centers, and hid Jewish family in his attic. So that was his enough moment. And, he's in his 20s. And again, it's also a teachable moment with my students, because the young men, he's like, I show them the picture of him in uniform, and that he's, forced to fight in this ideological campaign, which also involves a genocidal campaign behind the lines where he's been stationed. And, what would you do? And this raises some interesting quandaries and good discussions in the classroom. And there he is in Mirapole in the photo studio being photographed. He's at the center there. And a month later, he's going to take the picture that we've been studying. This is an era of photography, a kind of camera craze. So I talk a lot about visual culture and why are these images in existence, because it coincides with the rise of the handheld camera, which is being patented and widely distributed. And Germans, like 10% of the population by 1939, by the start of the war, they had their own camera. It was really very popular. We had a lot of hobby photographers. And then German leadership is saying, document our triumphant war. These are military journals where they're saying that the optical Panzer, that these handheld cameras can withstand shrapnel and withstand warfare, and they're a bridge between the home front and the battlefront. But of course, Hitler, they did not want their soldiers taking pictures of the crimes, of the atrocities, because they knew that they would be a source of resistance, but they couldn't control it. And in fact, that's what happened in the case of our photographer. The book, in trying to reconstruct the events of the site of the actual crime scene, I go bring the readers back to Mirapole, to this historic community that goes back to the 16th, 15th century, and the life that was there, the civilization of Mirapole, and what has been lost in the genocide, as far as the economy, the culture, the multi-ethnic experience there, and the traditions, and and the architecture. Even just look at this town. This is in 2014, and then I went back in 2016. Look at the vacancies here and what was a very vibrant marketplace. This was kind of the Jewish center of town, and a lot of this loss is compounded by Ukraine's history in the 20th century until today, right? I mean, we can talk about what's going on today as well. But this is the really the Sovietization, the terror famine, the Holocaust, World War II, the Soviet experience post-war, the collapse of the Soviet Union, hyperinflation, and now war with Russia. We followed the path that the Jews took that day based on this is the prison that kind of where some were detained as they were held before they were shot. And we have vivid testimony about that you've read. And this is the drawing that the Soviet prosecutor did. The Soviets investigated this and successfully convicted the Ukrainian killers in the picture, but the photograph was never used in the courtroom. The photograph was locked up in that Prague archive. But their investigation proved very helpful to my research. And here's a scheme, an actual sketch with the arrow that points from the center. That's where I was in the center of town. Then we go down here, and this is the park where they were actually murdered. That's the Soviet file, the killers who were arrested in 1986 and their fingerprints. And you can see this picture, these mugshots. And in fact, they are the same killers. You can do a match with the photos that our Slovakian photographer took. And the testimony in that case corroborates very well with the photograph, in contrast to the very perfunctory attempt by the West Germans to kind of look into the matter. And this is just a document that I found interesting because it's a regular police report, and a German who was part of that unit just went in 1969, decades later, and said, I want to report a crime. And the crime he's reporting is that scene that we're looking at in that image. But the West Germans interviewed a few people from that unit, and that was good to confirm who the killers were, but they really perjured themselves. And the big reveal there was to compare the photograph with the testimony and just see how many ways that they deflected, diverted, obfuscated their explanations about their participation. The search for the family was not as successful, and because it really, it had 960 victims, about 450 names to work with, and there was some repetition within there, some confusion. What could I do? This is a list of families who were killed in Mirapole, drawn up quickly when the Red Army returned in 44. And I can only see these clusters of surnames, of family names and birth dates that might help me find that boy, right? Who looks like he's about, the little boy who's kneeling there, looks like he's maybe 3 or 4 or 5. So I was always dating it based on that. And eventually found some testimony about a family. And it was so similar to this woman here, could be the woman who's bending over in the original photograph. That could be the child that's falling off of her lap. That could be the little boy in her hand. I could not determine that with certainty. I was not going to, but this is how this Jewish family, what's left of it, the women and children, the men had been killed already in the summer of 41, most of them. And they took this photo not long before they were murdered at that crime scene. These were victims who were shot on that day or thereabouts in that image. And I just find this a kind of beautifully haunting a portrait of what was left of that family, the Vasalyuk family. We showed the image to Ukrainian witnesses, people who knew these Jewish families and could give us more information and start to add more names to that list of Jewish families in Mirapole. And these are some of the peasants who were children at the time and witnessed these mass murders. And then we went into the actual site itself with Father Desbois' team. I basically asked them to come along. It's a French investigative unit. I can talk about that as well later. And found the bones of the victims, because the Soviets pursued this investigation in a pretty rough manner with their bulldozers and tractors. And that's what in the 80s, and this is what this exhumation dredged up these bones. And it was just another assault on these victims as far as their right to a proper burial and to be able to rest at peace. I end the book with the shoes. And I don't know if I have time. Josh, do we want to stop so we can have discussion, or do we want to have a little moment of reflection about the shoes? It's your call.
I appreciate being able to make that call. I think, I defer to you, Professor Lauer, but I think having a moment of reflection is great. It's such a heavy topic.
Yeah, as I was thinking about the shoes and having worked at the museum in DC for so long and being involved in the kind of memorial world of this work, and that comes through in the book, this intersection of not only research methods, but I think approach as far as how research intersects with memorialization, how putting together those family trees, you can say the names over the days of Yom HaShoah and speak to the volume as far as, 33,000 or more killed at Babi Yar, or one name, but how do we actually think about the missing? How do we, when we don't have those names? And these shoes were not, they're iconic representations in the way that they're displayed at museums and so forth. But already during the war, this issue of shoes was part of how Jews themselves, who were experiencing the Holocaust, thought about the loss of loved ones. And one of the most famous Yiddish poets from Lithuania, from Vilna, Abraham Sutzkever, and I highly recommend his work. A new book just came out. It's taken so long to be translated from Russian and Yiddish, and it also got a National Book Award for translation, professor out at Smith College, of all of his memoirs, diaries, his testimony at Nuremberg, and I highly recommend that book. I just ordered it, and it's really good. And he wrote in 1943, January 1st, a poem called A Load of Shoes. And he wrote it upon the discovery of his deported mother's shoes in the Vilna ghetto. And I just want to read 3 stanzas from it so we can wrap up. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride. Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others. In Sutzkever's poem, empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers. Unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today, enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronzed as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lauer. This was fantastic. So at this time, I encourage anyone who has a question to either raise your hand or to put it in the chat, and I'll do my very best to make it through all your questions. You can either put it in the public chat or send it to me directly. It's a really awesome opportunity to, ask Professor Lauer what you thought of the book. Professor Lauer, while some of those questions are coming in, I sort of had something that I wanted to ask, which was that, I think one of the things that many people found when reading your book is that it reads so fluidly. However, it's so hard to, read it in one setting because it's such a heavy topic. So thinking about people who want to learn from your book, but also recognize sort of the emotional, impact it has as well. How do you recommend people sort of differentiate between those two, acknowledging what happened while also wanting to learn from the future?
Well, it's everybody has a certain ability to deal with subject matter based on often their personal experience. I mean, the emotional piece is probably most likely driven by your own personal experience, your own personal history, right? I can approach this, and it doesn't mean that these images don't impact me, these testimonies don't impact me emotionally. Of course they do. But I don't have a direct connection to this history. I don't have family members who were killed in the Holocaust. And I don't have family members actually who kind of participated in the war. So I have that advantage of that kind of personal distance. It doesn't mean I'm not impacted because I'm a human being and these are, horrible images, and this is a horrible history of suffering that we all have to reckon with. So, but I can approach it in that way. And I also have an incredible support system here at the college as far as resources and all the institutions and my colleagues around the world that we're all kind of working on this together in all these different disciplinary ways as a human problem. So and I have students here. I think Lucy's on the call, engaged in this in the classroom and also outside the classroom in office hours. And that kind of intellectual exchange is like bolstering it and kind of affirming it, and then raising new questions and energizing it. So, you just kind of keep at it. And as you realize the magnitude of it, and I know in this time of crisis, we've all kind of started to identify really big issues. Things take on a different perspective, whether it's public health or the climate, or in this case, something like genocide, as far as our future and the peril that exists if we don't, address these things. So for various reasons, I continue to do this work.
That's awesome. And I should have added to everyone who's joining us today, I will do my very best to alternate between the chat and those other hands raised. So Brian, maybe I could pass to you first. Oh, here.
There, I think I'm unmuted.
There we go.
So thanks, Josh, and thank you, Dr. Lower, for a very powerful book, and thanks for talking to us today. One of the questions I had was about the history of the Jews in Mirapole before this event happened. And I thought that one of the most powerful things in the book was one of the other photos as well, the one on 72, the lower photo showing the victims shot along the path. And I think that that's been, something that's occurred to me as a question all along is how could people, what level of resistance did they have? How did they try to, when they were realizing what was going on, what did they try to do? And I think that shows that they tried to fight or flee or whatever it was, and then were shot along the road instead of shot in the ditch down the road. But I was wondering, kind of in the context of that, is how often were there pogroms in this area? Was it something where this population had lived for decades in peace, or were there pogroms, but they were, on a small scale of, obviously smaller than this, but was it, what was it like? And is there any documentation of that? I think that one of the things that people have commented about the Nazis is that they kept very thorough records, whereas the Tsar may not have, or whoever controlled the area.
Those are all really great questions, and you're touching on some real limitations as well that you've identified. So there are two pieces. First is the resistance at the time and the question of Jewish response and resistance to the Holocaust. And the second part is, kind of life before or experience before that may have informed their response, or, just what was that civilization, what happened, and especially during the period of Stalinization, so the 20s and 30s. So that's their generational experience. That's the most immediate. And it turned out that it was, obviously, they had seen the depths of human cruelty in the First World War and the aftermath of the First World War, pogroms that swept through this region, and the conflict between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, and the Ukrainian nationalists and the whites. And so during that revolutionary period of civil war, it has built into it pogroms, and Jews are kind of being scapegoated as far as which side are they on. They're being charged with being, subversive or spies, and you can see this in the literature. Ansky, I mentioned in the book, Jewish intellectuals who went down into these kind of vanishing shtetls and this civilization under siege, and tried to document it with photographs as well, and collecting stories. And so I would recommend the Ansky work from the First World War, as he was traveling and collecting these stories. And one of the stories he collected was the one about the Yiddish play, the Dybbuk, and that captured the kind of mysticism and the Jewish Orthodox existence and the rituals of the time, and the kinds of legends that were part of their understanding of history. And their traditions as far as the Hader, and their own welfare societies that they built up. And so there's that history that comes across that's very important, going back centuries, and what was left of that by the time the Soviets were done imposing a more secular system and trying to take the Jewishness out of their existence to make them all Soviet citizens, right? So that's what's happening in the 20s, and 30s is kind of a suppression of that. But by the time the Germans come, you have a community that has decreased significantly, either through loss of life or immigration or movement into the city for seeking kind of new opportunities that opened up in the Soviet system for Jews outside the village. And so it's kind of a remnant community of a mixture of traditionalists, because the grandmothers are still around, the memory is still there, the traditions are there, the recipes, the Shabbat. And so it's able to kind of exist in a quiet way, kind of, behind the scenes. But also this new generation of Jews who see possible emancipation through the Soviet system. And of course, the terror famine in the 30s and the purges and deportations, so that violence was also part of the history. And the anti-Semitism. I mean, that the Ukrainians who experienced the terror famine found it very easy to turn around and invoke, traditions of anti-Judaism and kind of apply that to their animus towards Stalin and the Bolshevik system. So it was a very precarious moment for the Jews when the Nazis arrived. Some Jews would say we were already broken spiritually by the time the Nazis arrived, and then the Nazis finished us off physically, biologically. So that was kind of the state of the community. At the moment of the mass murder, and not only here, but I find this in a lot of documentation when I get down to those actual reconstructing those events of carrying it out, you know, the night before, the day, and then the actual forcing the Jews to march to the edge of town or to the ghetto, and they know what's awaits them. They know it's going to be potentially a violent end. They're not naive about it, and they do try to run. They try to find hiding places with former colleagues and neighbors and make all these arrangements, and it's frantic. And often the parents are trying to take care of the children and find them hiding places. Sometimes they just push them to the side of the road and hope that they're going to land into the hands of someone who's magnanimous and righteous. So there is a lot of that, but the Nazis didn't want to document that. The Nazis didn't want to document the last statements of a Jewish man who's being forced to the edge of the pit and is declaring his faith in God or in Israel, or just that kind of resistance, because what it does, that resistance then forces the Germans to confront the fact that it's a crime, right? So instead they're reporting on how they're going like sheep to the slaughter, and they're trying to justify it by suppressing that actual history of resistance. And we see that in that last photo, Brian, that was a man and a quasi kind of family situation, and they were trying to escape and were shot along the path, trying to resist having to stand at that precipice and be shot.
Professor Lauer, our next question comes from the chat from Nicole, who also touched on how accessible your work is to non-scholars. And she wants to know what you're working on now.
Oh, wow. So I'm working on a project. Lucy's on the phone, if she's still on the phone, and she's actually working on it too. By the way, Lucy read my Ravine manuscript. And she knows it, the various forms that came in and caught typos and errors and all kinds of things. But I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to, acknowledge her here. And this is, of course, in addition to all of her schoolwork and her extracurriculars. And this happened over the summer and during the breaks. So I don't know, Lucy, do you want to say anything about Himmler?
Sure. Yeah, I can dive in on that. The current project that I'm working on with it's Professor Lauer and Professor Petropoulos' project, and then myself and Kogi Babcock, another student who works at the Mgrublian Center, are assisting on it. And it's really trying to track down Himmler's last days, last couple weeks, months, and figure out what happened to him. And that comes out of another movement in Holocaust studies, which is Holocaust denial, especially around Himmler. There's a lot of kind of conspiracy around his death, around what happened, whether he in fact committed suicide or was murdered by the British. And so this kind of gets at that aspect of the project and really combating denial with facts. And so it's a lot of fun diving through archives and trying to track down what happened to Himmler, his mistress, his family members. Yeah, so stay tuned.
Okay, terrific, Lucy. I'm taking you on the road with me. That was a great elevator speech for that next book project. Yeah, so it's Himmler's final days. A lot of people focus on Hitler in the bunker, and we think of the end of the regime as like everything's just collapsing in Berlin around, Hitler in the bunker, and suicide, when in fact, Himmler goes out into the open and is rather delusional, but also he's just, thinks he can continue on and be helpful to the Allies after the war. He's the most wanted war criminal, and yet he thinks he has a role to play in a post-German government, and that he can wield his forces, his police forces against the Soviets. But there are all these other facets too that Lucy mentioned about, the terror regime unraveling, and his family relations at that time, and who's he speaking to, and where does he go? It's very kind of granular. We're tracking him in northern Germany, and his intersections with death marches, his intersections with the aerial bombardment, the Cap Arcona, the sinking of these ships that had prisoners on it. So his world is really kind of crumbling around him, but he's out in the open, and then caught with a disguise on, and then brought over to British intelligence and interrogated, and he commits suicide. He bites down on a cyanide capsule when he realizes that he doesn't have a place in the post-war world. And the only thing I would mention about that we're still fleshing out, Lucy's been looking at some theoretical literature on this as well, is the topic of de-radicalization. A few years ago, I participated in a program called Stepping Back from the Brink with some genocide studies scholars, and we looked at different cases of at what moment does genocide not happen? What are the forces that dismantle, de-radicalize? So much in Holocaust studies, especially with Himmler, is fascination with his rise to power and his accumulation of power. And then his end is just kind of, quickly dealt with, kind of, okay, that's kind of pathetic what happened to him, or, it was inevitable. Yeah. But wouldn't it be instructive to know how, when we have someone like a Himmler in power, what can we do, or what happens to them traditionally? And we'll look at other cases of these henchmen, these historical henchmen, and maybe there's something to be learned there.
Awesome. So the next question comes from Jim, who asked, what was your process for deciding that this topic could be a book?
Oh, I didn't know it was a book until I didn't think I had a book until I found out more about the photographer, until I actually found his son through social media, and because I had the address where his family was from and so forth. And when we found the photographer's family and could get to his personal papers and the camera, his letters with his wife, and that story, I was like, okay, this is definitely a book. It's got that surprise element, like, oh, I thought this. It tests your assumptions in that way. It shows us, how resistance worked in those contexts. There's not a lot of material out there on resistance. It's one of the understudied areas. And I thought it was a book for a broader audience, because up until that point, it was more about research methods and analytical kind of framing and the questions we posed to sources and field work. And so I think that was probably a real turning point. I had the contract a lot earlier, but I was really nervous about what I was going to be able to deliver.
Wendy, the next question comes from Eugene Flynn, similar to the question I'd asked, which was, how do you personally feel while people were unloading such pent-up emotions in the process of the primary source work for this book?
Oh, yeah. So when you're doing these, interacting with participants, witnesses, whether they're victims or perpetrators or bystanders, and you're asking these questions and you're kind of receiving this information, they're all kind of different as far as how you relate to these subjects, these witnesses. With a perpetrator, and now most of them are gone, but I did have opportunity during the course of this book to interact with those different kind of types, if you will. Perpetrators are not there to find the truth with you if they agree to be interviewed, and it's not a kind of sharing with another person, empathetic sharing. It's more formal. It's more you're trying to extract something. It's a little bit more cat and mouse, a little bit back and forth. And whereas, with the survivors, you're trying to come to a discovery together, and it's a mutually supportive process, and you're trying to find the truth. You're not trying to trick each other or mislead one another. And there you can develop a relationship. It's a warmer exchange, more empathetic exchange. And with the witnesses, it's a little bit more ambivalent, because they have like shards of memory and things they're going to say, like those Ukrainian witnesses who are completely removed from our society of academic study and memorials and Holocaust consciousness as we know it. They just have like a piece that they can tell me, but it's usually a critical piece. Like, I saw this on this day, and he was wearing a green uniform, and he came in on a bicycle. And that's like, oh, okay, then that's probably this German unit, or this probably this. And so they just are more matter of fact. But sometimes they say things matter of factly that are anti-Semitic, frankly, like, oh, I remember the pogrom. I thought, oh, now's my chance to go into that Jewish shop and join the looters. So for the bystanders, it's a different type of interview experience.
Wow, yeah. The next question that I'll just read is, when the Soviets completed their exhumation of the grave in the 80s, do we have a sense of what the goal was? The goal for it was there less awareness of how to do it, how to do this respectfully at the time, and is this something that's better understood today?
Yes, that's an interesting question. It was a Jewish prosecutor actually who led the investigation, but it makes me think now, and I hadn't thought about this before. It's a very interesting question about his identity and what his kind of duty was as a Soviet investigator and how that might have crossed over into his own sense of Jewish identity and what he was doing to violate those souls in that grave. And remember, this is the Soviet system is not going to honor these religious ceremonies and burials, right? But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Jewish communities, cemetery preservation movements went in and immediately started to identify some of these sites to preserve them and protect them and talk about the heritage of Jews in these communities and what that consisted of, including maintaining cemeteries and burial sites. Because the Jewish cemetery in Mirapole is a mess, and it has been, I mean, since the war. So if that's not part of the culture, the Soviet culture, they're not going to be as sensitive to, well, we need the remains to prosecute, to convict. We need the victims to get a conviction. So they were determined to do that. But they did, in the exhumation, move remains of some of the victims to another site in town, and they erected a memorial. Jewish survivors flew back from Canada, and there was one who eventually went to Israel, and they, talked to the mayor of the town and said, we need to do something with these bones and give them this proper burial. So there was that attempt. And that's the one, when I went to Mirapole the first time and spoke to people and said, I'm here doing this kind of research, they didn't take me to that memorial in the center of town that I showed you. That was for the Great Patriotic War, that had nothing specific in there about the Holocaust. It was all Soviet citizens who suffered the way they interpreted it. They took me to that other site near the park where they specifically had Jewish victims from that massacre. And that's something that, Ukrainians are receptive to that, unlike right now Poles and Hungarians. And Ukrainian civic education and work in Holocaust studies has made enormous strides in the last 20 years, 30 years. We've had ambassadors in Ukraine who have been supportive of this and funded translations and programs at the Holocaust Museum in DC. I just went through all these fellowship applications, and several of them are from Ukraine. I would have never seen such kind of sophisticated, formulated research projects. We have teachers working on this, and they've been going to Yad Vashem. We've invested so much in the last few decades to try to secure, critical discourse, open, intellectual exchange on this history, given what we know how it's turned in Hungary and Poland, the neighboring countries. And so this particular crisis right now obviously has me deeply concerned about the fate of my Ukrainian colleagues, period, and their safety. I mean, I've been trying to contact my host family to make sure they get out and all of that. If things go the way they seem to be going, but it's going to be a real setback even within my own world of academic, developing an academic program there.
Professor, our next question comes from a guest who I didn't expect to be on our call today, which is Mr. Park's entire AP Economics class from Los Altos High School, who asked, in your view, is there anything different that Scarivener could have done aside from taking the photograph?
Yeah, that's a good question. This comes right up to these very important issues that have been debated in the history of photography, and photojournalism at war and at sites of genocide that go back to Susan Sontag's work on photography, and ethical debates over taking these pictures. In her earlier work, she said, aiming your camera like that on the victims that's no different than wielding the gun. That is, and she used that metaphor that you're participating by taking these pictures. And shouldn't you put your camera down and actually try to help the victims or disrupt the action in a way? Isn't that really the imperative there? And of course, our photographer didn't do that. He wanted to use the tools that he knew best, and that was his camera, It was also a very risky endeavor because he was brought in by the kind of Slovakian Gestapo right away in 43 and was questioned and harassed and followed, and the KGB followed him until the late 50s. And so, it had consequences for him as well. And then he undertook that campaign of hiding the Jews in his attic. He provided technical support to the Slovakian resistance movement and was bringing materials to the forest, and involved in armed resistance in 43 and 44. And he was recognized by the Slovakian government for that. So he not only took those pictures, but he then supplied, material for the armed resistance. He was not a violent person. I don't think he, wanted to fire a gun and actually participate in that way. But this was what he did. And then until he died, and he died in 2005, he brought his photos to that museum in Bratislava. He said specifically in his donation letter with the camera, could this be displayed in a museum, in an exhibit on the Holocaust? And by the way, you see these Ukrainians here as collaborators. Now I want to make sure that people know that happened too, and not whitewash that. So I think this is what he did within his means, and it was more than, frankly, most.
That's awesome. So Professor Lauer, we are now at time for everyone here. I figure we've got 2 more questions in the chat, which is okay with you. I'll field to you. And then at that time, I'll drop my email in the chat for anyone who might have additional questions that I could forward on to you. And just thank you all so much for being here. So the first of those questions, Jay, if it's all right, I'm going to ask your second question, which is, Professor Lauer, what is your view on the recent interest in the Wannsee Conference, a movie on the event, which Longrick's recent work, a moving of the killing of Heydrich, especially since your work places the beginning of the Holocaust much earlier in a more than German method? And if you need me to repeat that, I'm more than happy to.
So this sounds like there's a new film out on the Wannsee Conference or some sort of book. I'm not aware of it. There have been a couple of films on the Wannsee Conference, including one with Kenneth Branagh. Is that how you pronounce his name? So, and some really good documentaries that the Germans have done. And the questioner is referring to this famous meeting, January 20th, 1942, that was that Eichmann called, and Heydrich and that whole crew, which they basically announced to the German government officials, Foreign Office, Reichsbahn, Ministry of Interior, police, that we're going to pursue a European solution of mass murder. So that was more of an announcement than a moment of decision. And it was more of a moment of implementation in January 42. So we were just talking about this in my class yesterday. Lucy's shaking her head, and we were all reading the Wannsee Protocol together and looking at all the cast of characters who attended that meeting. And we were talking about the importance of decision making and how it happens over time, that there were multiple decisions and how consensus is built. When we say state sponsored, how does the state get to that point where they're mobilizing their railway system and all these different ministries to participate in this and in this form of kind of policy making. So that's, to me, is the significance of that. But the fundamental decision to murder occurred before January 42. It was tested out. In that picture we're looking at is an example of those critical days. It happened in October 41, according to Christopher Browning, and that picture was taken on October 13th. So it was fascinating to me when I wrote the chronology of catastrophe chapter to see how this photo from October 13th, 1941 fit into the context of, this was the day that Himmler was meeting with his crew about where to establish Belzets and how to find the right location for the first construction of the first gassing center. That this is a simultaneity of this, because they were emboldened by the fact that they could carry out these mass shootings in places like Ukraine.
Professor Lauer, for our last question, many of the primary resources have been kept away from historians. For example, these images were not available for research because they were behind the Iron Curtain. Are there areas that need to be explored? Are there other areas that need to be explored? Do we have a sense of how much still needs to be investigated?
Yeah, well, I think one of the challenges now is the necessity to have all these languages. As I said before, this is European history. And if you don't have those certain skill sets, it limits your ability to ask certain questions. We're already seeing in the world of COVID that people are reformulating their fundamental questions based on what's available digitally. And that's going to kind of warp our knowledge, because, you know, those limitations of circumstances, another layer of limitation. So I think that, you know, there's a lot more. I'm working on the de-radicalization piece of it, which I hope is a new area of exploration and analysis, and that might involve some of my colleagues in political science and other kind of theoretical comparisons. But I think that looking at the various countries now more in depth as far as their participation, not collaboration limited to those auxiliaries on the ground who are tools of the empire, of the system, who were motivated by a lot of different things. And it also were coming from places often of desperation themselves. So I'm not apologizing for them, but they are not the only face of collaboration. And that these other states, you know, the international kind of diplomacy and cooperation that occurred at the higher levels, I think is important, because it's just a really a different kind of leadership in Europe at that time. So I think that some of the international history could be better written at that level of collaboration.
Professor Lauer, thank you so much. The fact that we are only 3 minutes and 40 seconds over time, I think is pretty fantastic, all things being said. To everyone on this call, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that you'll keep an eye out for further installments of CMC Book Club with a faculty author. And now, if you want to unmute, or however your Zoom version of saying thanks is done, just join me in thanking Professor Lauer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.